Bread queues in Rafah today. The threat to this city, now packed with refugees from northern Gaza, is shifting stances across the west and today in Westminster. 137 days into the conflict, the Labour Party has hardened its instruction to the Israeli government.
The Rafah attack cannot go ahead. We are following our Five Eyes partners, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, who a few days ago made it clear that there has to be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We are mirroring that language and indeed the language now of the United Nations.
3 months after 56 Labour MPs defied Keir Starmer and voted for an SNP motion calling for an immediate ceasefire, Keir Starmer has moved towards them and called for just that.
I wanted us to call for an immediate ceasefire, which I wanted us to call for the last time we had the debate in Parliament. We're now doing precisely that. So we moved a significant way to a position which I am comfortable with.
Keir Starmer, shame on you!
A protest when Keir Starmer was defending his position in October last year.
While I understand calls for a ceasefire at this stage, I do not believe that it is the correct position now.
Since then, exactly what he's been calling for has changed.
Humanitarian pauses.
Sustainable ceasefire. Humanitarian truce.
Not just for a pause, but permanently. A ceasefire that lasts.
Keir Starmer yesterday celebrating by-election victories. His new, painstakingly assembled position on Gaza accepts Israel's right to continue fighting if Hamas violence continues to threaten Israel. It's not clear who would judge that.
You can imagine the distress it is for the local population.
The Prince of Wales, visiting the British Red Cross offices, heard an eyewitness account from Gaza and chose this moment when Western governments were shifting their stance on Gaza to wade in with a statement of his own. I remain deeply concerned about the terrible human cost of the conflict in the Middle East since the Hamas terrorist attack on the 7th of October. Too many have been killed. The phrasing and punctuation don't explicitly attack Israel, but some thought the timing and the wording suggested exactly that. The Israeli government spokesman tonight said, "We appreciate the Prince of Wales' call for Hamas to free the hostages. We also recall with gratitude his statement from October the 11th, confirming Israel's right of self-defence against Hamas." Just over 5 years ago, Prince William was the first member of the royal family to visit the occupied Palestinian territories. Kensington Palace said Prince William would soon visit a British synagogue where he would discuss efforts to combat anti-Semitism.
Well, joining me now from Westminster is the Shadow Secretary of Defence, John Healey. Thanks very much for coming on the programme, John Healey. I guess the first question is, what took you so long?
Well, we've been arguing for weeks for an immediate stop to the fighting, for more aid into Gaza, for the hostages to be released, and we've been working for weeks, publicly and privately, to add our weight, even as an opposition in the UK, to efforts to put pressure on both Hamas and Israel to come to an agreement that allows us to see a ceasefire, an end to the fighting, that can lead then to a lasting peace and a diplomatic path to a two-state solution, which in the end is the only guarantee for Israel's long-term security and that the rights of the Palestinians are properly respected and fulfilled.
There are people in your party who would argue that it hasn't been for weeks, that only now, in the last few days, has the language firmed up. But I just want to delve into one particular issue. In the statement it says Israel can continue fighting as long as Hamas continues to threaten violence. So does that mean that a single Hamas missile fired from the Gaza Strip against Israel, one of those missiles that is shot down by the Iron Dome, is that a sufficient reason to allow the Israelis to continue fighting in the Gaza Strip?
Well, first of all, Keir Starmer has called weeks ago for a ceasefire as well as more aid and to get the hostages out. But what we're setting out tonight and arguing for tomorrow, just as we have in private, is that any ceasefire has to be respected on both sides. It has to be one that lasts and can build towards a long-term process that is diplomatic and that can secure something that is peace in that region that we've not seen for decades.
But crucially, there are caveats in there that in your book would allow the Israelis to carry on, dropping bombs on Palestinian civilians in the pursuit of Hamas. And they would say, we're doing exactly what the Labour Party has suggested we should do, which is to carry on fighting as long as there's a threat of violence.
No, quite simply, it's a statement and a motion, a declaration of intent that recognises a ceasefire has to be respected fully by both sides. And for those early on, after those dreadful terror attacks and the carnage of October the 7th that were calling for an immediate ceasefire then, were essentially saying Israel does not have a right to defend itself, does not have a right to go after the Hamas terrorists. The situation has developed and changed. We want to see an end to the fighting now. What we're doing is reinforcing the arguments and reflecting the position of allies, as David Lammy said to you in your film, an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
Okay.
It's what Australia, New Zealand, Canada and other nations are now calling for.
But it's the thing that's really changed.
The importance...
It's the thing that's really changed here is that you're afraid that the next rebellion in the Commons, against the leadership of your party, with the SNP motion, would have been even bigger than the last rebellion. That's what's really changed.
No, what's changed is that the Israelis are threatening a humanitarian catastrophe with a ground offensive in Rafah, and we say quite clearly in a way that the SNP do not, that cannot go ahead. What has also changed is in the private diplomacy that we've had involved with Keir Starmer going out to the region, and over the weekend at the Munich Security Conference when he met with the German Chancellor, the US Secretary of State, the Prime Minister of Qatar, the Saudi Arabian Foreign Minister. The discussions we've had there were about how you plot a path to an end to the fighting that can last, that is respected by both sides, but crucially can then lead to the hard task being undertaken to plot a long-term path to peace. And that's what we're interested in. That's what we're interested in seeing. That's what we're interested in securing. That's what we're working for in private, not just calling for in public.
Run out of time. James Healy, thank you very much indeed. Now, there's been a similar about turn in Washington. The US has drafted a UN Security Council resolution calling for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza linked to the release of hostages held by Hamas. Washington traditionally shields Israel from UN action, and it did so again today, angering many by vetoing an Algerian resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire. Well, let's get some clarity from our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy. Siobhan.
Well, Matt, the US has always declared that a ceasefire in Gaza won't work because they say it would give Hamas the chance to regroup, to gain strength. So it is significant today that the US ambassador to the UN is using the word and has even put forward a ceasefire plan. Let's hear the exact words, though, that she used.
In line with President Biden's comments last week, our text calls for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza as soon as practicable, based on the formula of all hostages being released. Last I checked, no one here opposes this.
Well, you'll note a couple of caveats there. Firstly, they are saying that the ceasefire must be temporary. They're calling for a break in the violence of at least 6 weeks, which they hope will lead to a durable peace. And they say that the ceasefire must be implemented as soon as is practicable. That's different to the Algerian resolution put forward this morning that the US, as you said, rejected, which called to an immediate and permanent ceasefire. The major sticking point seems to be who blinks first. The Algerian resolution calls for Israel to stop the violence first and then for the release of hostages, whereas the US plan thinks that the hostages should be released at the same time as the cessation of violence, and that seems to be the major stumbling block. As for the UK, they abstained in this vote earlier, and they seem to have come up with something in between. They are calling for an immediate suspension of the fighting to get aid in and hostages out, and they hope that that will lead to a permanent, sustainable ceasefire. It is not clear if any of these plans will come into fruition anytime soon. And briefly, what did President Biden have to say today? Well, I was here earlier when he left on his helicopter to the West Coast for a campaigning event. He was asked by me whether or not when he wants that ceasefire to kick in. He did not say. He was asked by another reporter whether or not he had an evacuation plan for Rafah, and he did not answer that question either.
Thanks for all.